The stagecoach rolled into Harlan Creek on a Thursday afternoon in the autumn of 1879, trailing a cloud of red dust that settled over the main street like a warning. And the woman who stepped down from it said the first honest thing anyone in that town had heard in 6 years. The driver, a barrel-chested man named Corbin who had been hauling passengers across the New Mexico territory for longer than most of Harlan Creek's residents had lived there, jumped down from the box and reached up to take a small leather trunk from the roof rack. He set it in the dirt beside the wheel. The woman who followed him down the iron step wore a plain gray traveling dress that had seen better days, a pair of sturdy boots that had clearly walked more than their share of miles, and a look on her face that suggested she had already calculated exactly what she needed and had no patience for anything beyond that. She was 26 years old. Her name was Mae Rourke. Her dark hair was pinned back in a way that was practical rather than fashionable, and her eyes were a sharp, steady brown that made people feel they were being read before they'd opened their mouths. She stood in the street and looked at the collection of wooden buildings around her, the dry goods store with its peeling sign, the saloon with its half-hinged door, the narrow bank with iron bars on the windows, and the livery at the far end where a horse was tied and dozing in the afternoon heat. "Is this the whole of it?" she asked Corbin. "Ma'am, the town. Is this the whole of it, or is there more around the bend?" Corbin looked at her. "That is the whole of it." Mae Rourke nodded once, as if confirming something she had already suspected, and picked up her trunk. The 3 men sitting on the porch of the saloon had been watching since the stagecoach came to a stop. The nearest one, a heavy-set rancher named Dub Tilsley, who considered himself something of an authority on the subject of women and their appropriate behavior, leaned toward the man beside him and murmured something that made them both laugh. Mae walked past without looking at them, which made Dub Tilsley laugh harder, and then stopped laughing when it was clear she truly was not going to glance over. The woman she had arranged to stay with was named Clara Finch, a widow who ran a modest boarding house on the 2nd Street back from the main road. Mae found it without asking for directions because Clara had included a hand-drawn map in her last letter, and Mae was the kind of woman who read letters carefully and kept the parts that mattered. Clara Finch opened the door before Mae had finished knocking, which told me that Clara had been watching from the front window, which told me something useful about Clara's temperament. She was a soft-looking woman in her late 40s, with kind eyes and the careful manner of someone who had learned to be gentle with people in order to get along. "You must be Mae," Clara said, holding the door wide. "I am," Mae said, and came inside. Clara looked at the trunk and then back at Mae. "Was the journey very hard?" "It was a stagecoach journey in September across dry country," Mae said. "So yes, it was hard, but I expected it to be hard, so I have no complaint." Clara blinked. Then she smiled, and it was a real smile, the kind that comes when someone surprises you pleasantly. "I think you and I are going to get along fine," she said. Mae set her trunk down in the small room Clara showed her, which had a window that looked out over a back garden where dry tomato plants were staked in neat rows. She washed the dust from her face and hands in the basin Clara brought, changed into a clean dress, and came downstairs to find that Clara had set out bread and cold chicken and a pot of coffee. They sat at the kitchen table, and Mae ate with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had learned that a meal was a thing that required your full attention, and Clara asked careful questions about the journey and Mae's life before Harlan Creek. Mae had come from a small city in Missouri called Jefferson, where she had worked for 4 years as a schoolteacher, and before that had lived with her father, a man who had been a decent man but not a particularly present one, and her mother, who had died when Mae was 15. She said this plainly, without self-pity or decoration, the way you state facts about geography. Clara nodded and listened and refilled Mae's coffee cup and did not say anything that might have been condescending. "The school advertisement said the position had been empty for 2 terms, Mae said, cutting a piece of bread. "Why couldn't they keep a teacher?" Clara folded her hands around her cup. Well, the last teacher was a young man named Henry Pratt. He left to get married in Albuquerque. Before him was a woman named Dorothea Sims, and the town council asked her to leave. Why? Clara hesitated in the way that people hesitate when they are deciding how much of the truth to give. Me noticed it. She was thought to be too strict, Clara said finally. Too strict for children who needed to learn to read and write. Clara's smile came back, slower this time but more genuine. You may find that Harlan Creek has some particular opinions about how things ought to be done. I generally find that every place has opinions about how things ought to be done, me said. And I generally find that about half of those opinions are wrong. Clara laughed, a short, bright sound that seemed to surprise her. I think, she said, that you are going to cause some trouble. Probably, me agreed and drank her coffee. The school was a single-room building at the north edge of town, whitewashed once upon a time and now the color of old cream, with 12 benches inside and a cast-iron stove in the corner and a blackboard that had been improperly installed and leaned slightly to the left. Me walked through it the following morning with her arms crossed and made a list in her head of everything that needed to be addressed. The supply of chalk was almost nothing. The McGuffey readers were old enough to be crumbling at the corners. The stovepipe had a crack in it that would need to be seen to before winter. She went to see the town council that afternoon. The council met in the back room of the bank, which was also the office of the bank's president, a man named Vernon Holt, who was somewhere in his middle 50s, and had the particular kind of authority that comes not from being impressive, but from being the person who controls the money. He sat behind a large desk, and the two other council members, a dry goods merchant named Peavy and a rancher named Carstairs who smelled strongly of cattle, sat in chairs to either side of him like decorative accessories. Me sat down across from them, set her list on the desk, and said, "The school needs supplies, and the stovepipe needs repair before the first cold week, or the children will be breathing smoke." Vernon Holt picked up her list and looked at it over the top of a pair of spectacles. "Miss Rourke," he said, and his voice had the patient quality of a man who has explained things to a great many women and expected to be thanked for the effort, "we are grateful to have secured a teacher of your qualifications. The school has functioned for some time with the supplies currently available, and it has functioned for some time without a teacher," me said. "That is different from functioning. The chalk is insufficient for daily instruction. The readers are too deteriorated for some of the pages to be legible. These are not preferences, Mr. Holt. They are conditions that prevent learning from occurring." The three men on the council looked at her with the particular expression of men who have been corrected by a woman and are deciding how to react. Peavy's mouth opened and closed like a fish's. Carstairs looked at the ceiling. Vernon Holt set her list back down on the desk with a small, precise motion. "I will take your concerns under advisement," he said. "I would prefer a commitment to action," me said. There was a silence. Holt's expression did not change, which was itself a kind of change, the kind that meant something was being held back. "Miss Rourke," he said, "you have been in Harlan Creek for less than 24 hours. I would suggest that you take some time to understand how we do things here." "I understand how you do things," me said, picking up her list from the desk. "You delay, and then you do nothing, and then the problem gets worse, and then you delay some more. I have seen it in 3 other towns. I would like to avoid it in this one." She folded the list and put it in her pocket. "I will speak to you again on Monday about the chalk and the readers. The stovepipe I will see to myself, since I imagine you have a man who handles such things." She left. Outside on the bank steps, she stood for a moment and let out a slow breath. Down the street to her left, 3 horses were tied at the rail in front of the saloon. Across the street, 2 women in better dresses than Me's were coming out of the dry goods store and had stopped to watch her exit the bank with the careful interest of people who had heard something had come to town and were now looking at what it was. Me looked back at them steadily, not hostile, just honest in the way of a person who has no interest in pretending not to notice, and they looked away first. She was not trying to intimidate anyone. She simply had not learned the habit of pretending to be something smaller than she was, and she was not going to learn it here. On the other side of the street, coming out of the livery, was a man who had stopped with one hand on the door frame and was looking at her. He was tall, with the kind of lean build that comes from outdoor work, dressed in a worn canvas coat and plain work trousers and boots that were muddy at the heel. He had dark hair that was slightly too long in the way of a man who spent more time working than attending to personal appearance, and a jaw that hadn't been shaved in 3 or 4 days. He was, she would later estimate, somewhere around 30, which would put him several years ahead of her, but not by an uncomfortable amount. He was not staring at her the way Dub Tilsley and his friends on the saloon porch had stared at her the day before, which had been a stare designed to evaluate and dismiss. This man was looking at her with what appeared to be genuine attention, the way you look at something that has interrupted your train of thought in a way you didn't expect. Mae did not know who he was. She nodded at him with the same brisk honesty she gave to everyone, turned, and walked back toward Clara's boarding house. Behind her, inside the livery hand who worked for the man said, "You know who that is?" Stephen Garrett turned away from the door. He went back to the horse he had been examining, a gray mare with a tender left foreleg that he had been asked to look at as a favor to her owner. He crouched down and ran his hands along the leg with practiced care. "No," he said. "Should I?" "That is the new schoolteacher. Clara Finch wrote to hire a teacher all the way from Missouri, and that is apparently who answered." Stephen looked at the horse's hoof. "She just came out of the bank looking like she told Vernon Holt something he didn't want to hear." "Wouldn't surprise me one bit," the livery hand, whose name was Tommy, said cheerfully. "Word is she walked off the stage yesterday and started asking questions about the town like she was taking inventory." Stephen set the mare's hoof down gently. The leg was not broken. It was a sprain, and with rest and time it would heal. He stood up and dusted his hands on his trousers. "There is nothing wrong with asking questions," he said. He paid more for the mare's shoeing than the job required, as he generally did when he thought Tommy needed the money more than he did, and rode back out to his property, which was a ranch of middling size 3 miles east of town on a good stretch of land that ran along the creek that gave the town its name. He had bought it 4 years ago when he came through the territory and recognized the quality of the soil and the regularity of the water, which was not something you took for granted in New Mexico. He ran a small cattle operation and a larger operation in horses, because he understood horses better than he understood cattle, and because the territory had an ongoing appetite for good horses, what with the Army presence at the fort and the range of traffic through the region. He cooked his own supper that evening, beans and salt pork and cornbread in the cast-iron skillet, and he ate it at the table he had built himself from lumber hauled out from Albuquerque, and he thought about the woman on the bank steps. He thought about the particular quality of the way she had stood there. There had been nothing defensive in it, nothing that suggested she knew she was being observed and was performing for an audience. She had simply stood on those steps and existed in the world with a kind of undisguised directness that he had not seen in a long time, and which had startled him the way clean, cold water startles you when you have been expecting something lukewarm. He was aware, a man who had learned over years to appreciate plain dealing above most other virtues. He had grown up in Virginia and had come west young, at 19, following his older brother Caleb, and 2 friends after the war had rearranged their expectations of what life in the East would look like for men of their background. Caleb had died of fever in Kansas in 1873, and the 2 friends had gone their own ways, and Stephen had come down through Colorado and Arizona and eventually settled in New Mexico because the land suited him, and because somewhere in the process of losing the people he had started out with, he had grown accustomed to his own company. He was not a man given to self-pity. He was a man given to work and to quiet and to the particular pleasure of a thing done well. He got up early. He worked until the light went. He read in the evenings when he was not too tired to hold a book, which was sometimes and sometimes not. He went into town when he needed to, which was once a week on average, and he spoke when he had something to say, which was not always as often as people around him seemed to expect. People in Harlan Creek generally liked Stephen Garrett, but they were a little uncertain about him. He was helpful when help was needed. He was honest in his dealings. He had once helped 2 Mexican families on the east side of the territory when a local rancher had tried to run them off land they had worked legally for 20 years, a situation that had earned him the permanent regard of those families and the permanent wariness of a certain kind of man in the town. But he was not easy. He didn't perform warmth. He was not cold, but he had no interest in pretending to more friendliness than he felt, and in a community where a great deal of social commerce ran on performed friendliness, this made him slightly unreadable. He thought about the woman on the bank steps for 3 days before he had occasion to speak to her. The occasion was the general store, which was where most occasions in Harlan Creek began. Mae was there on a Saturday morning, buying chalk, because the town council had not yet committed to action, and she had decided she would buy the chalk herself and remove their delay from the equation. She was at the counter when Stephen came in for rope and a new file, and the particular kind of bolt that Peavy's store usually stocked. She was speaking to Peavy's wife, who ran the counter when Peavy was in back, and she was saying, "I need 4 boxes of chalk if you have them, and if you only have 2, then 2 will do. And I will need a new slate board before the end of the month, as the current one is mounted at an angle and I cannot correct it without replacing the backing." Mrs. Peavy, who was a nervous woman with the habit of looking at the door when spoken to, said, "Well, I don't know that we stock the slate board specifically, Miss Rourke. I would need to ask my husband." "You can ask him," Mae said, "and if he doesn't stock it, I'll write to Albuquerque for one. But I wanted to ask here first." Stephen moved to the far end of the counter and waited. He was close enough to hear the conversation clearly. Mrs. Peavy put 2 boxes of chalk on the counter and then said, with the manner of someone conveying important information about local customs, "Miss Rourke, I wonder if perhaps you might find it easier in the long run to let Mr. Peavy and the council sort out the school supplies. They do have a system." "Their system," Mae said, taking the chalk and reaching into her bag for coins, "took 2 terms to hire a teacher. I don't think their system is running at full efficiency." Stephen spoke before he had made a decision to speak. "She's right," he said. Both women looked at him. Mrs. Peavy looked flustered. Mae looked at him with the same steady directness she had given everyone else, which he found, up close, even more striking than it had seemed across the street. "Excuse me," Mae said, not rudely, but genuinely. "The council's system," Stephen said, moving to the counter and setting down the items he needed. "It took them 8 months to get a proper lock on the schoolhouse door after the old one broke. 2 winters ago the children spent a month in the cold before the stove was repaired. They run slow on things that don't affect their own property." He said it without heat, just as a statement of fact. He looked at me. "You are the new teacher." "I am," she said. "Mae Rourke. Stephen Garrett. I have a ranch east of town." She looked at him. He looked at her. It was not a long look, not theatrical or charged in the way of novels, but it was a look that registered something. The way 2 people sometimes look at each other when they have both been speaking a language that no one else around them uses and suddenly realize they are doing it in the same room. "You know the council's habits," she said. "Have you ever raised the matter with them directly?" "A few times, and they listened politely and did nothing." "That matches my experience from Thursday," Mae said, and a small dry humor entered her tone that he recognized as the kind of humor that comes from people who have observed a great many things clearly and have made peace with what they see. He found himself wanting to smile, which was not something he found himself wanting to do with great frequency. "The stove pipe," he said, "the crack in it." She looked at him more sharply. "You know about it. I've been inside the schoolhouse. I do odd repair work when things are needed and no one else is attending to them. I looked at that pipe last spring and mentioned it to Holt. He noted it. And did nothing. and did nothing. I can fix it. I have the materials at the ranch, and I can come Monday morning before school if you want it done before the first cold snap." Me looked at him for a moment. He had the distinct sense that she was taking his measure in the same practical way she had been taking the measure of everything else in Harlan Creek since she arrived, inventory style, accurate and without sentiment. He held the look without difficulty, because he had nothing to hide, and was not trying to be anything other than what he was. "All right," she said, "Monday morning. The school opens at 8. Come at 7 if you need time to work." "I'll be there at 6:30, he said, "to be safe." The corner of her mouth moved. It was not a full smile, but it was the suggestion of one, precise and small and real, and it struck him somewhere in the chest like a note from a bell that had been waiting to be rung. Mrs. Peavy, who had been watching this exchange with the expression of a woman watching a weather event develop, put Stephen's items on the counter and told him the cost, and he paid without looking away from me until he needed to, which was not as soon as it probably should have been. Me picked up her chalk. "Thank you, Mr. Garrett," she said. "Miss Rourke," he said. She left the store. Stephen stood at the counter for a moment after the door closed behind her. Mrs. Peavy looked at him with the expression she reserved for things she intended to discuss thoroughly with her husband later. "She is a very direct sort of person," she said carefully. "Yes," Stephen said. He tucked his rope and file and bolt under his arm and headed for the door. "It's the best thing I've heard in years." He said it simply, without drama, already thinking about the stovepipe and what materials he would need to bring Monday morning. And it was only after the door swung closed behind him that Mrs. Peavy stood alone in her store and thought about what he had said and how he had said it. Monday morning, Stephen arrived at the schoolhouse at 6:15, which was earlier than he had promised, and which he attributed to the fact that he had misjudged the drive from the ranch, and not at all to the fact that he had been awake since 4:30 turning over unnecessary thoughts about a woman he had spoken to for 10 minutes in a general store. Me was already there. She was inside, sweeping the floor with a broom she had apparently brought herself since the school's broom was a thing of disintegrating straw, and she had the blackboard detached from the wall and leaning against one of the benches. The morning was cool, and the smell of old wood and chalk dust mixed with the clean, dry air that came in through the window she had opened at the back. She looked up when he came in and said, "I thought you said 6:30. "I was wrong about the drive," he said, which was only partial honesty but was not entirely a lie. "The board is off the wall. I found the problem. The mounting bracket on the left side was installed incorrectly. The angle is fixable." He looked at it. She was right, as he could see immediately. The left bracket was mounted with the wrong orientation and had been that way since installation, which meant someone had simply accepted it without question for however many years it had been there. He went to work on the stove pipe first, because the cold was the more immediate risk, and she swept around him without either of them feeling the need to make conversation, which he found remarkably comfortable. After some time she said, "Where did you come from originally? You don't sound like New Mexico." "Virginia," he said, from up near the ceiling where he was checking the upper joint of the pipe. "Came west after the war. Been in the territory 4 years. You seem settled here." "I am," he said. "The land is good, the people are tolerable." There was a brief pause. "Only tolerable," she said. He climbed down from the step he had been using and looked at her. "Most of them," he said. "A few are better than that." She held his gaze for a beat, then went back to sweeping. He went back to the pipe. By the time the children began to arrive at 5 minutes to 8, the stove pipe was repaired. The blackboard was remounted correctly and level. Me's brought chalk was distributed along the tray, and the schoolroom looked more functional than it had in some time. Stephen packed his tools and stepped outside to find 3 children standing in the yard watching him with the frank curiosity of children who don't yet know they're supposed to pretend not to stare. He nodded at them and started for the road. Behind him, he heard Me's voice beginning the school day, clear and steady, and without the practiced sweetness that some teachers used with children as a kind of management strategy. She was talking to them the way she talked to everyone, directly. And from the brief sound of it as he moved away, the children were paying attention. He was back in town on Wednesday because a horse he had been asked to break for a rancher named Elkins needed to be picked up from the livery. And as he was riding back out, he passed the school at its morning recess. The children were in the yard. Mae was standing at the corner of the building with a cup of something hot, watching them, and she saw him pass and raised the cup in the small acknowledgement that passes for a greeting between people who are not standing close enough to converse. He almost stopped. He kept riding, but the whole ride home he was aware of having almost stopped and of not having done it, and he thought about this in the particular way that means something is working on you. On Friday he stopped. He told himself he was checking on the schoolhouse pipe, which was a reason that would have fooled no one, including himself, but it gave him a frame for the action, and Mae, who saw him coming from the window, came to the door at the end of the school day when the last child had gone home and said, "It's holding." "No smoke. Good," he said. "I wanted to be sure." She stepped out onto the small step in front of the door and looked at the sky, which was turning the particular shade of amber that the New Mexico sky achieved in early evening, and which Stephen had never been able to look at without a feeling that was close to gratitude. "It's beautiful here," she said. "Yes," he said, "in the evenings especially." "Missouri doesn't look like this," she said. "The sky is different, lower somehow, or that's how it feels. Here it feels very high." "It is high," he said. "The elevation changes the whole quality of it." She looked at him. "You know about elevation." "I read," he said. There was something in her expression when he said it, a shift that was too small to name exactly but which suggested she had been expecting one thing and received another and found the adjustment pleasant. "What do you read?" she asked. He thought about it. Geology, history, some natural philosophy, whatever the book merchant in Albuquerque sends up. He knows my taste by now and picks for me. "You have an arrangement with a book merchant. It's more efficient than browsing." The small smile appeared again. It was becoming something he looked for. That smile, the way you look for a landmark when you are navigating unfamiliar country. "I taught natural philosophy for a term in Jefferson," she said. "The school board thought it wasn't appropriate for the children, particularly the girls. They removed it from the curriculum." "That is," Stephen said, "genuinely stupid." She laughed. It was a full laugh this time, surprised out of her, and it changed the whole architecture of her face in a way that he found himself considering long after it had passed. "Yes," she said, "it is. I said something along those lines to the board and they asked me to moderate my tone." "Did you?" "No." He looked at her for a long moment in the amber evening light with the school at their backs and the sound of the town, a small distant noise down the road and the creek audible in the silence between them. "Would you like to walk to the creek?" he asked. "There is a path that goes down from behind the school. It's good walking in the evenings." She considered it. He had the sense that she was not a woman who made decisions quickly or carelessly, that she gave even small invitations their proper weight. Then she said, "Yes." "Let me get my coat." The path to the creek ran through dry grass and low scrub, and the creek itself was nothing dramatic, a persistent stream between flat banks with willows leaning at intervals over the water. But in the evening it had a particular quiet that was different from the quiet of the open desert, which could feel large in a way that was sometimes too large. This quiet was companionable. They walked along the bank without hurrying and talked. Not the careful talk of people who are being cautious with each other, but the easier talk that comes when two people have decided, for reasons they haven't fully articulated, to be honest. She told him about Jefferson and about the school there, and about why she had answered Clara Finch's advertisement for a teacher in a territory she had never been to. He asked her why she had wanted to leave, and she thought about it carefully before she answered. "I was good at my work," she said, "and I had good students, and I was respected within certain limits, but the limits kept getting tighter. Every year there was something new I wasn't supposed to teach or wasn't supposed to say. And I kept saying it anyway, and that was becoming a problem. I thought it might be better to start somewhere new." "You thought the territory would have fewer limits," he said. I thought the territory might have different ones, and different ones I can work with. Same ones over and over just make me tired. He considered this. It has different ones, he said. Some of them are worse, but some of them are genuinely wider. That's honest. I thought it probably was your preference. She glanced at him sideways. Most people don't say things they think I might not want to hear. Most people don't know if you want to hear them, he said. I had the impression you did. The look she gave him then was different from any of the other looks she had given him. It was not the practical assessing look of a woman taking inventory, and it was not the brief warm look of someone who has been surprised by a joke. It was longer and quieter and more complicated, and it was the look of someone who has found something they recognized and was still deciding what to do about it. They walked back in the growing dark, and he left her at the road where it turned toward Clara's street and tipped his hat, and she said good night with the particular tone of someone whose voice is doing slightly more work than the words require. He rode home under stars that the New Mexico sky provided in extraordinary quantities, and thought about her with a focus and a pleasure that he recognized. In the clear-eyed way he tended to recognize things as something quite significant. The town's reaction to me was becoming a regular feature of Clara Finch's table conversation. Clara heard things because people came to her boarding house for supper twice a week, and because she was the kind of person who listened more than she talked, and she reported to me with the gentle accuracy of a naturalist describing a species she was fond of. Dub Tilsley said you were too big for your britches, Clara reported on a Tuesday evening, with the apologetic tone of someone delivering unpleasant news. What britches would those be? Me asked, spooning sweet potato onto her plate. He means you speak too plainly. He told his wife that you lack feminine delicacy. I have never found delicacy to be a particularly useful quality in a classroom, Me said. Have you noticed that men never accuse each other of lacking delicacy? A man who speaks plainly is decisive. A woman who speaks plainly lacks feminine something or other. Clara nodded over her plate. Mrs. Carstairs told me you were rude to her husband on the council. I was not rude, Me said. I was specific. Those are different things. In Harlan Creek they are the same thing, Clara said, not without sympathy. Then Harlan Creek needs new definitions, Me said, and ate her sweet potato. But it was not all opposition. The mothers of the children in Me's school were, within 2 weeks, demonstrably warmer toward her than the social circle that revolved around the council and the saloon. This was because their children were coming home different. Not dramatically different, but measurably. The children were engaged. They talked about school at the supper table in ways that had not happened before. One girl named Lucy Elkins, the rancher's daughter, who had been considered slow because she could not read letters reliably, was being taught by me to trace them with her finger, and had made what her mother described as startling progress. Me had recognized, with the clear eye she brought to everything, that Lucy did not process written letters the same way most children did, and that this was not stupidity but a different kind of seeing, and she had adjusted her instruction accordingly without making a spectacle of it. Lucy's mother, whose name was Rose Elkins and who was a quiet and decent woman of 32, came to the school on a Thursday to thank me, and stayed for an hour, and left with something in her face that suggested the kind of relief that follows a long worry being resolved. Stephen heard about this from Rose's husband, the rancher Elkins, who mentioned it in passing when Stephen came to deliver the broken horse, and in whose voice there was something that Stephen recognized as a man who has been shown something about his child that has moved him, and who doesn't know quite how to say so. She's a good teacher, Elkins said. Different from what we've had. She's different from most of what there is, Stephen said, which was more than he had intended to say to Elkins, but Elkins just nodded as if that was perfectly reasonable. Stephen and Me's walks along the creek became a regular event without either of them formally proposing it. They simply began to appear there independently in the early evening and to continue together, and after the third or fourth time it would have been strange to stop. They talked about everything. Books were a major subject, since they had this in common in a community where it was not the most common thing to have. Mae had read widely and opinionatedly, and she said what she thought about what she had read, which Stephen found invigorating in the way that any real intellectual engagement is invigorating to a person who has been starved of it. He pushed back on her when he disagreed, which was not infrequently, and she pushed back in return, and these arguments went nowhere except into comfortable silence and then into new conversation, and neither of them kept score. He told her about Caleb one evening, the brother who had died. He did not plan to tell her. They were sitting on a flat boulder near the water, and she had asked him, simply and without setup, what had brought him specifically to New Mexico rather than stopping somewhere else, and he found himself saying things he had not said out loud to anyone in a long time, not because he had been hiding them, but because there had been no one who made him want to say them. She listened. She did not fill the silence with reassurances or perform sympathy. She just listened with the full quality of attention she brought to everything, and when he was done, she sat for a moment and then said, "He sounds like he was the kind of person who made other people better by being near them." Stephen looked at the creek. "Yes," he said, "that's exactly right." They were quiet for a while. A bird he didn't know the name of called from the willows on the far bank. The air was turning cold in the specific way of New Mexico autumn evenings, which is not gradual but sudden, as if the temperature has made a decision. "Are you cold?" he asked. "Not yet," she said. He thought, sitting there with her in the early dark, that he had not felt less alone in a very long time. He thought about this carefully, because he was a man who tried to be accurate with himself, and he decided that what he felt was not merely company, but the specific comfort of someone whose presence added something to a moment rather than subtracting from it. He had been in rooms full of people who subtracted from the moment by being in it. Mae Rourke did not do this. She added, every time. He also thought about her hair in the particular light the last sunlight threw before it vanished, and about her hands when she gestured, which was not infrequently when she was making a point, and about the sound of her laugh, which he had now heard several times and which had the quality of something that was not given away easily and was therefore worth more when it was given. He acknowledged to himself on the ride home that night, in a considerable amount of trouble. He came to Clara's boarding house the following Sunday with a book. He had not planned to do this either, but he had received his monthly shipment from the Albuquerque book merchant, and there was among the books a volume on the natural philosophy of the American Southwest, its geology and native flora and the general character of the land, and he thought she would want it. So he went. Clara answered the door, and her expression was warm in a way that suggested she had opinions about his visit that she was keeping carefully to herself. And she said Mae was in the garden with her tomato plants, which were apparently being revived from their late summer dormancy with some focused attention. Mae was on her knees in the dirt with her sleeves rolled up and her hair half escaped from its pins, turning soil around the roots of a plant with a small trowel, and she looked up at him with a smear of dirt on her jaw and no particular concern about it. He held out the book. She took it, looked at the title, and sat back on her heels. "This is exactly what I wanted," she said, with a simple force that was better than enthusiasm. "I thought it might be." She opened it and looked at the first page and then at the contents page and then up at him. "Thank you," she said, genuinely. He had brought things to people before, gifts of practical utility, and been thanked for them in the way that people thank you for things they are expected to want. Mae thanked him in the specific way of a person who has received the exact thing they needed and knows it. He felt the warmth of it in his hands. He crouched down in the garden space near her and looked at the tomato plants. "They'll come back," he said. "The soil here holds heat well into autumn. Give them another week. You know about tomatoes, too." She said, "I know a little about most things that grow," he said. "Comes with the land." She was looking at him with that quiet, complicated look again. He was getting better at reading it. It was the look she gave when she was thinking something she hadn't decided to say yet, and there was in it, he was now fairly sure, something that mirrored what he was sitting with himself. He cleared his throat. "Me," he said, and the use of her name without the miss was small but deliberate, and both of them felt it. "I would like to take you to supper. Not at Clara's. There's a place in town that does a reasonable meal on Sunday evenings. I'd like to take you there." She looked at him steadily. "Is that a social call?" she said. "Or are you asking to court me?" He appreciated that. He appreciated it so much that he almost smiled before he answered. "The second one," he said. The look she gave him was warm and direct and unambiguous. "Then yes," she said. "I would like that." The Sunday supper was at a modest eating establishment run by a Mexican woman named Senora Valdez, who cooked better than anyone else within 30 miles and who seated them at a corner table and brought them a meal of red chili stew and fresh tortillas and something sweet with piloncillo to finish, and asked no questions, which Stephen respected. The food was good, and the light was the warm, golden light of an oil lamp, and they talked until Senora Valdez's place was empty, and she came to clear their table with the patient look of a woman who is too polite to actually tell people to leave, but has made her opinion clear by stacking everything around them. Walking back through the town at night, their breath small clouds in the cold air, Stephen found himself slowing his pace in the way of someone who does not want a distance to close, and he noticed, was walking at the same slowed pace, and when they reached Clara's door she turned to face him and the lamp on the porch threw a soft light across her and he thought she was, without any qualification he could add to it, wonderful. "I had a very good evening," she said. "So did I," he said. He wanted to kiss her. He did not, because one dinner and weeks of walks beside a creek, however significant they felt to him, did not give him the right to assume. He said good night, and she said good night, and he walked to where his horse was tied, and rode back out of town with the warmth of the evening still sitting in his chest like something banked and tended. 3 days later she kissed him. They were on the creek path and she had stopped to look at something in the willows, a yellow bird neither of them could name, and when she turned around he was closer than she'd calculated, and for one beat they were very near each other in the cold evening, and she put her hand on the front of his coat and kissed him. It was brief and deliberate, and it was the most honest thing he had felt in a long time. When she pulled back she looked at him without uncertainty which he had expected and said, "I've been wanting to do that for 2 weeks." "I've been wanting to do that for 3, he said, and kissed her back, and this time it was neither brief nor quick, but it was still honest, deeply honest, the way of 2 people who mean exactly what they're doing. The town, of course, noticed. Harlan Creek was not a large community, and a man and a woman walking together in the evenings, and taking Sunday supper at Senora Valdez's, is not an unobservable fact. The reaction was mixed in the specific way of small communities, where the principal social economy runs on managing what is appropriate. Dub Tilsley told his friends that the schoolteacher was forward, and that Stephen Garrett had always been strange anyway, and they deserved each other. Mrs. Carstairs told her circle that it was irregular for a schoolteacher to be conducting a courtship so openly, and that the school board might have thoughts. Vernon Holt mentioned to the council that the question of Miss Rourke's continued contract was something they might want to revisit in the new year. Rose Elkins told her husband that Mae was the best thing that had happened to the school, and that anyone who moved to dismiss her was going to have to answer to the parents of her students, and her husband said that seemed right to him. Clara Finch told me that people were talking, with the tone of someone who felt she was obliged to mention it but was not herself alarmed. Mae said, "Let them." Clara looked at her for a moment and then said, with the quiet satisfaction of someone making a final judgment, "I will." The trouble, when it came in the form of Vernon Holt calling a meeting of the school board, which was technically separate from the town council though all 3 members were the same men, to discuss Miss Rourke's behavior and her continued suitability for the position. Stephen heard about the meeting from Tommy at the livery, who had heard it from the blacksmith, who had heard it from Peavy. He rode into town on a Wednesday afternoon and went directly to the bank. He found Holt at his desk. "I heard you're calling a meeting about the teacher," Stephen said, putting his hat on Holt's desk and sitting down across from him without waiting to be invited, which Holt noticed. "The board has a responsibility," Holt began. "She fixed your stove pipe," Stephen said. "She hired a carpenter with her own money because the school didn't have the funds, and the carpenter was a fair one, and Lucy Elkins can read now. John Elkins drives 120 head of cattle a year through your bank's operation, and he's grateful. You may want to think about that." Holt looked at him. "This is about conduct, Garrett, not about. It's about the fact that she is a plain-speaking woman in a position of authority, and some people in this town are not comfortable with that," Stephen said, with the flat precision of someone who has been patient with a thing for long enough. "And plain speaking is not misconduct. I know the difference. So do you." There was a long quiet. Holt leaned back in his chair. He was not a stupid man. He was a man who had built his authority on the inertia of convention, and convention was a flexible thing when the people with economic weight in a community shifted their support. John Elkins was not the only rancher whose goodwill he needed. Mrs. Elkins had apparently spoken to several of the other mothers, and the mothers had spoken to their husbands, and the picture Holt was getting from the economic landscape of Harlan Creek was not one that supported the expense of antagonizing the school's first competent teacher in several years. "The meeting will be about reviewing the supply budget," Holt said at length, "which I believe has some items that need attention." Stephen picked up his hat. "I believe it does," he said, and left. He told me what he had done, and she looked at him for a long time. He expected her to tell him she didn't need anyone to speak on her behalf, which was what he had prepared himself to hear and had been ready to acknowledge as completely correct. Instead, she said, "Thank you. I appreciate it. I would have fought it myself, but it's good to know you were there." He thought about this afterward and decided that it was the right thing to say. It acknowledged both her own capability and the fact of what he had done without pretending either of them had not occurred. "I know you would have fought it yourself," he said. "I know," she said. They were at the creek. The water was lower now in November than it had been in September, and the willows had gone gold, and the air was sharp and clean. He put his arm around her shoulders as they walked, and she settled into it without making anything of it, comfortable and natural. And he thought that this specific ease was a rare thing, rarer maybe than he had understood a thing could be. He was in love with her. He had been moving toward this conclusion for several weeks, and had arrived at it with the same careful certainty he brought to most things, which meant he was quite sure about it, and not looking for reasons to revise his conclusion. He was 30 years old, and he had lived a life in which feeling had been present but not abundant, not because he was unfeeling, but because the right things to feel had been absent or had not stayed long enough, and this was something else entirely. He was going to tell her. He was deciding how. He told her on a Sunday evening in late November, sitting on the flat boulder by the creek with the last light going fast and the first stars coming in from the east, which was where the stars appeared first in New Mexico, coming up over the mountains in the distance. He said it simply. He said, I am in love with you." She turned to look at him. He waited. "I know," she said, and before he could decide what to do with that, she said, "I love you too. I've known it for about 3 weeks, and I've been deciding whether to say it or let you say it first." "Why would you wait?" he asked. "Because I wanted to see if you would say it without me saying it first," she said. "I need to know if you can say hard things without being pushed." He looked at her. "And you can," she said. He laughed, which was different from smiling, a real full sound that went out into the cold air over the creek, and she smiled back at him with the full smile, which he had seen a handful of times and which was extraordinary, and he pulled her close against him, and they sat like that with the stars coming out overhead and the creek running dark and quiet below them. Winter came to Harlan Creek in December with a week of hard cold that frosted the windows in Clara's boarding house and brought snow to the tops of the mountains in the east. Mae's school stove worked without issue, and the children came every day in their coats, and she taught them and they learned. And by the end of the term, she had advanced the 3 oldest students past where they had been expected to be, and the others were solidly ahead of the prior year's measures. The school board, with the adjusted budget that Holt had quietly approved after his conversation with Stephen, had supplied chalk and new readers and a properly mounted blackboard, and the school looked like a school rather than a storage room where children occasionally sat. Stephen came for supper at Clara's on Thursdays, which Clara had encouraged with the particular warmth of a woman who has decided that something good is happening in her house and intends to support it. He brought firewood the first week and helped Clara fix a loose step on the porch, and these actions cemented him in Clara's regard in a permanent way. On a Thursday evening in December, he came for supper, and after the meal, with Clara tactfully occupied with something in the kitchen, he sat across from me at the cleared table and said, "I would like to ask you to marry me." Me looked at him. "I know that's direct," he said. "I appreciate direct," she said. "I know you do." "That's part of why I'm asking." She folded her hands on the table. "I have conditions," she said. He looked at her with the steadiness that she had come to understand was his version of warmth. "Tell me them," he said. "I keep teaching," she said. "Marriage doesn't end the school. I know there are people who think a married woman has no business in a classroom, and those people are wrong. I'm not going to stop teaching." "That never occurred to me to ask," he said honestly. "Good, and I want to be consulted. About the ranch, about decisions that affect us both. I'm not asking to run the cattle operation. I know nothing about cattle. But I'm not a decoration, and I'm not a silent agreement machine." "Me," he said, "I asked you specifically because you are not those things." "I know," she said, "but I wanted to say it." He reached across the table and took her hand, which he had not done before at a table, only in the dark on the creek path, and her hand was warm and capable and rested in his with the easy comfort of something that belonged there. "So," he said, "is that a yes?" She looked at him for one more long moment, and in it was everything she had been since she stepped off the stagecoach, direct and clear and exactly what she was, and she said, "Yes, it is." Clara, coming back into the kitchen with a pot of something, took one look at the two of them and set the pot down and went back out again with the soft, pleased smile of a woman who has seen exactly what she expected to see and is satisfied with it. They were married in February of 1880 in the small Methodist church on the east side of town, which was the respectable thing to do, and which satisfied the community's need for a ritual while not taking more time than necessary. The ceremony was brief and sincere. Me wore the best dress she had, which was dark blue and not white because white in a New Mexico winter was impractical, and she said her vows in the same plain voice she used for everything, looking at Stephen directly, and he said his looking back at her in the same way. And when it was over, they walked out of the church into sharp, cold air, and Clara Finch was crying with happiness, and Rose Elkins was applauding, and even Tommy from the livery was there in a clean shirt. Dub Tilsley did not attend. Vernon Holt attended and shook Stephen's hand and said something careful about wishing them well, and Stephen accepted this with the same equanimity he brought to most things. Senora Valdez cooked the wedding supper, which was the best meal Stephen had ever eaten, and at the end of it he danced with me in the cleared space of the church hall to the music of a fiddle player whose name was Arroyo, and who played for events in the county, and who had a gift for slow melodies that made the air feel different. Me was not a dancer by training, but she was light on her feet in the specific way of people who are at ease in their own bodies, and Stephen was a decent dancer, because he had learned in Virginia before the war, and the knowledge had stayed in his feet, if not in any other part of his life. They danced through 3 songs, and at the end of the third she looked up at him, and the candles in the church hall threw light across her, and he thought for the 100th time, and meaning it more each time, that she was exactly who she was, and there was nothing he wanted to change or add, only to keep very close for a very long time. Me moved to the ranch. She rode the 3 miles to school in the mornings on a small, sturdy chestnut mare that Stephen had selected for her with care, a horse with a smooth gait and reliable temperament named Dutch for reasons that were obscure, and that Mae accepted without asking about. She rode into town and she taught, and she rode home, and some evenings she found Stephen at the table with a book, and some evenings she found him still outside, and she would go out and watch what he was doing. And their evenings were the continuation of the Creek evenings, but warmer and longer, and with more of the particular domesticity that is its own kind of comfort. The ranch house was not large, but it had 2 main rooms and a kitchen and a sleeping room, and Stephen had added a room off the kitchen before the wedding specifically, because he thought she would want a place to put her books and her papers. And she had walked into it and turned around and looked at him and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "This is the most thoughtful thing anyone has ever done for me," with the direct feeling of a woman who does not exaggerate. He had built the shelves himself from the same lumber as the kitchen table, fitted and smooth, and they ran along 2 walls and were already half filled with his books and half empty, in anticipation of hers. Spring came and the creek rose, and the willow trees along the bank put out new leaves that were the particular light green of very new things. Mae's garden, which she had established at the south side of the ranch house in a sheltered spot that got good afternoon sun, was producing with the reliable energy of well-tended soil. She had taken advice from Senora Valdez on what grew well at this elevation and had planted accordingly, and the results vindicated the consultation. There was a matter in spring that required attention that was not pleasant. Dub Tilsley and 2 men who did work for him had begun making regular comments in town that were specifically aimed at Mae's teaching, suggesting to anyone who would listen that the school was being run improperly, and that the children were being given ideas that weren't suitable, which was a charge that meant, when translated, that the girls in the school were being taught the same content as the boys, and that Lucy Elkins and the other girls were being given the same expectations for reading and mathematics and natural philosophy as their brothers. This came to a head when Tilsley went to Vernon Holt and formally requested a review of the school curriculum, producing a list of subjects he felt were inappropriate for the female students. Mae found out about this through Rose Elkins, who had herself heard it at the dry goods store and had come directly to the school with her color up and her voice steady in the specific way of a woman who is angry and controlled. "He named Lucy specifically," Rose said. "He said it wasn't natural." Mae looked at the list Rose had brought, which Rose had copied out from what she had seen in Holt's office. She read it twice. Then she put it on her desk and said, "I will handle this." She went to Holt's office, and this time she brought Rose Elkins with her, and she presented to Holt a 3-page document she had written that morning, which laid out in specific detail the academic progress of every student in her school over the past 6 months, with particular attention to the students who had been behind grade level when she arrived and where they now stood. She then said, calmly and with the complete authority of someone who has the facts and knows it, "Every student in this school is learning. Every student is ahead of where they were. If Mr. Tilsley would like to account for the educational harm he believes I am causing, I would like to see his figures." Holt looked at the document. He looked at Rose Elkins, whose husband's cattle operation was one of the 3 largest in the county. He looked at me. "The review will not be necessary," he said. Mae collected her document, thanked him for his time, which was perhaps the most pointed use of politeness she had deployed in the territory yet, and left. Stephen heard the full account that evening, and when she finished, he said, "You are the most effective person I have ever met." "I just have the facts," she said. "Most people have the facts," he said. "Not everyone knows what to do with them." The summer of 1880 was warm and steady, and the ranch did well. Stephen's horse operation had expanded to include a contract with the fort at the edge of the territory, supplying remounts at a price that made the operation fully self-sustaining, and he hired a hand named Aurelio, the son of one of the Mexican families he had helped years earlier, who was 21 and good with horses, and whom Stephen trusted completely. Aurelio came with his younger sister Lucia to the wedding supper, and Lucia and me had made a friendship by the end of the evening that deepened over the months into the kind of ease that does not require much maintenance, because it is grounded in genuine mutual regard. Me taught through the summer term, which was shorter but which she maintained because she had students who needed the continuity and who would not otherwise have anything to do that advanced them. She taught Aurelio's sister Lucia in the evenings on Tuesdays and Thursdays at the ranch table, because Lucia's Spanish literacy was strong but her English reading was still developing, and me had neither patience for gaps nor any belief that gaps were fixed. She told Stephen about Lucia's progress with the same engaged focus she brought to her school students, and he listened with real interest and occasionally asked questions that showed he had been thinking about it between conversations. And these evenings at the table with their books and their talk and the lamp between them and the New Mexico dark outside the window were the specific texture of happiness that me had not known to expect from a life she had largely constructed on her own. She was also, by late summer, expecting a child. She told him on a Thursday evening with the same directness she brought to everything. She had confirmed it with the nearest woman with medical experience, which was a midwife named Mrs. Bauer who lived at the edge of town and who said me was about 4 months along and in good health. Stephen, hearing this, sat very still for a moment. Then he stood up from his chair and came around the table to where she was sitting and crouched down in front of her and took her hands and looked at her face. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am well," she said. He was quiet for another moment. He was, she understood, doing what he always did when something moved him deeply, which was letting himself feel it all the way down before he spoke, so that when he spoke it was true. "I am going to be a terrible worrier," he said. She laughed. "I know you are going to have to manage that." "I will try," he said. He brought her hands to his mouth and pressed his lips against them both at once and looked at her over them. "Me," he said. "Thank you. You were present for the relevant events," she said. He laughed, and she loved the sound of it, as she had loved the sound of it from the first time it had happened beside the creek in the cold evening, full and unguarded and wholly his. Their son was born in March of 1881, in the ranch house with Mrs. Bauer in attendance and Clara Finch present at me's request, because Clara was steady and warm, and me trusted her in the way you trust people who have proven themselves over time. Stephen waited in the front room for 4 hours that were, he later told Tommy at the livery, without qualification the longest 4 hours of his life. He sat and stood and sat again and went to the window and came back, and Aurelio, who had come that morning to attend to the horses, and had stayed out of a combination of concern and the good instinct not to leave a man alone at a difficult time, sat on the porch step and said nothing, which was exactly right. When Mrs. Bauer came to the front room door and said that me was well and they had a son, Stephen stood up so quickly he knocked his chair back and had to stop and set it upright before he could go through the door, which Mrs. Bauer said afterward was the funniest thing she had seen in a year. The boy was small and red, and had a remarkable amount of dark hair for a newborn, and he was the most extraordinary thing Stephen had ever seen. "He needs a name," me said. She was tired in the clean way of a person who has done very hard work and come through it, not depleted but settled, and she held the baby with the careful, sure hands she brought to everything. "I was thinking," Stephen said, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed and looking at his son, Thomas, for no particular reason except that it suits him. Me looked at the baby. "Thomas," she said. "Thomas Garrett." "Thomas Caleb Garrett," Stephen said quietly, and me looked at him with the look that was the fullest expression of her love, which she showed in many ways but never more clearly than in moments like this when she understood something he hadn't finished saying. "Yes," she said. "That's right." Caleb had been his brother's name. Thomas Caleb Garrett came into the world in New Mexico in March of 1881 and was put to bed in the cradle that Stephen had built over the course of the winter, a solid and carefully made piece of work in maple that was the best piece of furniture he had ever constructed. The first year of Thomas's life rearranged everything. not in the way that makes people tired and resentful, though there was plenty of tired, but in the way that adds a dimension to a thing that was already good, makes it fuller and more complex and more worth protecting. Stephen was a father in the practical, engaged way. He was a rancher and a husband, present and attentive, not performing fatherhood but doing it. And me was a mother in the specific way. She was a teacher and a person, direct and loving, and completely honest with the small person in her care. She went back to teaching in September, with Thomas in a crib in the corner of the classroom, which the school board technically had no official position on because no one had anticipated the specific circumstance. There was murmuring. Clara Finch, when she heard the murmuring, told the person murmuring to her directly that Mae Rourke Garrett was the best teacher Harlan Creek had ever employed, and that the baby was quiet and not a disruption, and anyone who wanted to take it up with the school board was welcome to do so on their own time and without her company. The murmuring subsided. Thomas was, in fact, a remarkably good-natured child, who was interested in everything and distressed by very little, and who, by the following summer, was crawling at speed through every part of the ranch house, and laughing at the horses over the fence in the particular helpless way of a small person who finds the world extremely funny. Stephen watched his son and his wife on a summer evening from the porch, me holding Thomas up at the fence rail to see the horses up close, the boy's face transported with joy, me speaking to him quietly, pointing things out, naming them, and he thought of all the things he had not expected when he came west at 19 following a grief he hadn't known how to carry, and how strange and complete it was that they had led here, to this specific evening, to this woman and this child and this particular light. He had told her once, walking along the creek in winter before Thomas was born, that he had not thought much about the future when he first came west. He had thought about the day ahead and the week ahead and occasionally the season, but not further than that, not with any genuine expectation of what was in it. She had looked at him and said, and now he had thought about it. Now I think about it, he had said, with interest. The town changed around them as towns do, slowly and then quickly. Vernon Holt's bank expanded its operation, and Holt himself mellowed by small degrees, whether from age or from the practical recalibration that comes when the community's opinion shifts around you. Dub Tilsley left Harlan Creek in the winter of 1882 for reasons that were rumored to be financial, and which no one who knew him was particularly sorry about. New families arrived in 1882 and 1883. Drawn by the same things that had drawn Stephen, the quality of the land and the regularity of the water, and Harlan Creek grew from a cluster of wooden buildings on a dry road to something that was beginning, very slowly, to look like a town with intentions. Mae's school grew with it. By the fall of 1882, she had 23 students, which was more than the single room could efficiently hold, and she went to the school board and made the case for expansion with the same document-backed specificity she brought to everything. And this time Holt said yes without requiring her to wait him out, because he had learned by now that waiting Mae Rourke Garrett out on a thing she had the facts for was an expensive use of time. Aurelio, who had by this point been working the Garrett ranch for 2 years, and was as settled a part of the operation as the horses themselves, brought his mother to the expansion celebration, a small afternoon gathering in the schoolyard where Clara Finch brought cake. His mother, Donna Elena, was a small, direct woman of 50-something whose regard for Stephen was the warm and steady regard of a person who does not forget what has been done for their family. She and me spoke for an hour in the mixture of English and Spanish that me was by this point increasingly comfortable in, having learned from Lucia over the past year with the earnest focus she brought to anything worth learning. Donna Elena told me at the end of the afternoon that she was good for this land and this town. She said it in Spanish and me understood every word, and her answer was also in Spanish, imperfect but clear, and Donna Elena nodded with satisfaction. Stephen, standing nearby and catching all of this, thought about me arriving off the stagecoach 2 years before with a leather trunk and a list in her head, and the undisguised directness that had made Mrs. Peavy nervous and Dub Tilsley angry, and him stop in the doorway of the livery and look across the street and think, "There is something here I have not seen before." He was right. There had been something he had not seen before, and it had walked into this town and fixed its stovepipe and argued with its council and taught its children and married him and given him a son, and was standing in the schoolyard in the afternoon light speaking Spanish to Dona Elena with the same uncomplicated willingness to do what needed to be done that had characterized every moment he had known her. The second child came in the spring of 1883. A girl, this time born in the same room as Thomas, attended by the same steady Mrs. Bauer and greeted by Thomas, who was too and very interested in the proceedings, with the solemn fascination of a small person confronted with something entirely new. They named her Clara Rose Garrett, and when me told Clara Finch this at the boarding house, Clara sat down and pressed both hands to her face and was quiet for a moment, and me sat beside her and put her arm around her and was quiet too, and after a while Clara said, "That is the kindest thing," in a voice that was thick with it, and me said, "You have been family to me since the first day." She might as well know it. Clara Rose was born with Stephen's coloring, the dark hair that Thomas had gotten from me and Stephen in equal measure, but lighter eyes, the particular gray that occasionally appeared in the Garrett line, and the serene self-possession of a child who has arrived knowing who she is, which made her mother laugh the first time she observed it and Stephen look at me and say, "I see where she got that." They had 4 children by the time Harlan Creek had grown enough to require a second teacher at the school. After Clara Rose there was another boy, James, in 1885, and then a second girl, Nora, in 1887. The ranch by this time had expanded twice, and the horse operation was one of the best regarded in the territory, with a reputation for quality that had gotten into the networks of men who moved horses professionally and had brought buyers from as far as Colorado. Stephen was, at 38, a man who had arrived at himself fully, not peacefully in the sense of having no motion in him, but peacefully in the sense of having nothing that needed to be resolved at the expense of something else. He knew what he had, and he was grateful for it in the specific and daily way that gratitude operates when it is not performed for an audience. Me was 34 and had been teaching in Harlan Creek for 7 years, and had outlasted 3 school board compositions and 2 attempts to reduce her curriculum, and 1 very badly thought-out proposal to reduce her salary on the grounds that she now had the support of a husband, which she countered with a 2-page document and the full weight of the parents of 23 students, and which was withdrawn before it even reached a formal vote. She had also started a second-class 2 evenings a week for adults who could not read, which was a thing she had proposed to the board as an extension of the school's purpose, and which the board had approved with less resistance than she expected, possibly because they had learned what resistance cost. The class had 12 students in its first season, men and women from the range of the community's edges, the families who had been in the territory before the Anglo settlers, the newer immigrants, the people who had slipped through the cracks of whatever systems were supposed to provide this, and me taught them with the same direct and unjudging approach she brought to everything. On a Saturday evening in October of 1887, Stephen came in from the last round of the evening to find me at the kitchen table with Nora asleep in the crib beside her, and the 3 older children in bed, and a lamp lit, and her papers for the adult class spread around her. She was reading something, her chin in one hand and her elbow on the table, and she looked up at him when he came in with the look that was the version of her smile that he loved most, the one that was not a performance but a recognition, the look that said, "You." He came and sat across from her and poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove that was still warm. Outside, the October night was full of cold stars and the distant sound of the creek, which was higher now in autumn than it had been that first September when he had met her coming down the bank steps. Nora was restless, Mee said, gesturing at the crib. She'll sleep now, he said. James and Thomas. Out like lamps. Clara is reading under her blanket. I could see the light under the door. He looked at the crib and at the papers on the table and at Mee's face in the lamp light. Everything he had was here in this room or in the rooms above him. He thought about this with the regularity of a man who has the habit of counting what matters, and it never felt like enough to say. "Come outside for a minute," he said. She looked at the crib. "She'll stay asleep," he said, "just for a minute." She came out with him onto the porch, wrapping her arms around herself against the cold, and they stood and looked at the New Mexico sky above them. It was the sky that had struck him as worth stopping for when he first came through the territory. Enormous and clear and full to the edges with stars that you could not see like this anywhere with walls too close. "Do you ever think about where you would be," he said, "if you hadn't answered Clara's advertisement?" She thought about it. "Still in Jefferson," she said. "Probably still fighting the school board about the curriculum. Getting tired of it. And you're not tired of it here." She turned to look at him. "No, I'm not tired of it here." "Why not?" She considered him for a moment in the way she had considered him many times with the full weight of her attention. "Because here there is more that's worth fighting for," she said. "And because I have you to come home to, which makes fighting for things less expensive." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they looked at the stars for a while in the cold and the quiet. "I was in the livery doorway," he said, "when you came down the bank steps, that first day." She looked up at him. "I know, I saw you. You nodded at me. You were staring." "I was," he said. "You were remarkable." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I thought, he doesn't look at me the way the other ones were looking at me." "How were the other ones looking at you?" "Like I was an inconvenience that had arrived in the mail," she said. He pulled her a little closer and pressed his lips to the top of her head, which was the specific motion of affection he made when feeling overtook his vocabulary, which still happened even after years, more than he would have predicted. "You were not an inconvenience," he said. "I know," she said. "You called me the best thing you'd heard in years." He pulled back a little. "What, Mrs. Peavy told Clara who told me," she said, and her voice had the small, warm amusement in it of a woman who has kept a good thing stored for a while and chosen her moment carefully. "When you left the store the day we met, she said you said I was the best thing you'd heard in years. She found it very strange." He looked at her for a moment, considering whether to be surprised by this or not, and decided not to be. He said, "She found it strange." "She found it strange," Mee confirmed. "It was true," he said. She put her hand on his face, her warm, steady hand, and looked at him. "I know," she said. "That is the thing about you, Stephen. What you say is what you mean." He turned his head to press his lips against her palm. "Same as you," he said. She smiled, the full smile, the best one. "Well," she said, "we are well matched then." "We are," he said. "Exactly." They stood on the porch a while longer with the stars overhead and the children inside and the creek in the distance and the horses quiet in the dark behind the fence. The ranch stretched around them in the cold, solid and worked and known, the good kind of known that comes from years of attention and care. Eventually, Nora made a small sound inside, and Mee turned back toward the door. Stephen followed, and he took the crib while she banked the stove for the night. And when Thomas appeared at the top of the stairs asking for water in the sleepy, confused way of a 6-year-old who has woken for no particular reason, Stephen went up and got him water and tucked him back in and sat on the edge of the bed for a moment until the boy's breathing evened out. He paused in the hallway after, listening to the house. Clara's light was out now. James was making the small whistling sound that was his particular brand of deep sleep. Nora was quiet. From downstairs came the soft movements of me finishing up, the click of a lamp being turned down, the light creak of the fourth step, which had a slight give in it that he had been meaning to fix and somehow never got around to because there was always something that mattered more. He thought he might fix that step this winter, before the season got fully hard. He thought about it with the pleasant, mundane specificity of a man whose future is full of manageable and worthwhile things to do, and that in itself was a kind of richness he had not always been sure he would have. Me came upstairs and they went to bed and lay in the dark with the cold pressing against the windows and the warmth of the quilt in each other. And before sleep she said, quietly, "We have a good life." "We do," he said. "I want you to know that I know that," she said. "I don't take it for granted." He found her hand under the quilt and held it. "Neither do I," he said. Outside, the New Mexico night was complete and large and full of the cold stars. And Harlan Creek sat quiet in the dark with its school and its bank and its saloon and Senora Valdez's, and the creek that gave it its name. And on the east road 3 miles out, the lamp in the Garrett ranch house went dark last of all. Spring came again, as it had come every year, and with it, the particular smell of wet earth and new green that even the high desert produced in its measured way. And me planted her garden again with the careful knowledge of 7 springs in this soil. And Stephen repaired the fence line that the winter had disturbed. And Thomas and James helped in the imperfect, earnest way of boys who are not quite strong enough for the task but committed to it absolutely. And Clara Rose, who was 5 and had her mother's eyes and her father's quiet, sat on the fence rail and watched with the serious interest she brought to everything. And Nora, who was 2 and fearless, needed to be retrieved from the vicinity of the horses 3 times before noon. Life proceeded as good lives do, not without difficulty, not without the ordinary frictions and worries of work and weather and the unpredictable, but with the solid infrastructure of 2 people who understood each other and trusted each other and had made together a thing worth maintaining. Me taught the school until the second teacher was hired in 1888, a young man from Santa Fe named Horace Kimball, who was fresh from a normal school and nervous, and whom me mentored with the same direct care she had always given to the people under her instruction, telling him what she observed clearly and without cruelty, praising what he did well and correcting what needed correcting. And Horace Kimball, who had expected to find this intimidating and found it instead bracing and useful, became a good teacher and told people for the rest of his life that Mae Garrett had taught him more about teaching in 1 year than his training had in 3. The adult literacy class she kept herself, because it was a thing she had started and believed in, and because the need for it did not diminish as the town grew. If anything, it expanded. And she taught it 2 evenings a week for years after Harlan Creek had moved beyond the rough frontier settlement it had been when she arrived and become something more settled and more complicated. In the evenings, when the children were older and no longer required the constant attention of small people, she and Stephen had their evenings back in something close to the form they had taken when they first began walking beside the creek. Longer conversations about books and ideas and the territory and the country beyond it, and the things happening in the world, which were numerous and not always simple. They disagreed with the same productive frequency they always had and arrived at the same comfortable place on the other side of it. They had, as the years compacted into the specific weight of a life genuinely lived, become the kind of people who were known to the community not for their prominence but for their reliability. When something was needed, you could ask Stephen Garrett and he would do what he said. When a child was struggling, Mae Garrett would see it and address it and not require you to ask twice. When the territory went through the political changes that came with approaching statehood in the 1890s, and the complications that came with those changes for the Mexican families and the older land grant holders, and the people whose claims to this land ran deeper than any Anglo settlers. Me wrote letters and attended meetings, and Stephen rode to Albuquerque twice to speak on behalf of Dona Elena's family's land claim, which was in dispute from a lawyer working for an Albuquerque land company that had developed a professional interest in acquiring old grant properties. The claim was upheld. The land stayed with the family it belonged to. Thomas Caleb Garrett grew up on horseback and was his father's partner in the ranch by the time he was 17, and showed every sign of having the same qualities in dealing with horses and land that Stephen had, plus his mother's precise way with numbers, which made him formidably competent in the business side of things. James was bookish in the way that occasionally turned up in families and surprised everyone, and went east to study in 1903 with his mother's full and vocal support, and his father's quietly expressed pride. Clara Rose, who had her mother's directness and her father's steadiness, became a teacher herself, which surprised no one who had watched her in her mother's school. And Nora, the youngest, married a rancher's son from a valley to the north and brought the same fearlessness she had applied to horses as a toddler to the management of a cattle operation in the mountains, and did it extremely well. And me and Stephen grew into the middle years of their lives with the particular grace of people who have not performed their happiness, but have built it out of the consistent daily work of knowing each other and choosing each other again, not once in a ceremony but repeatedly, in 1,000 ordinary moments across the span of years. The look across a room, the hand taken in the dark, the argument fully finished, and the joke shared after, the quality of attention that is the deepest form of love. The attention that says, "You are real to me, all of you, and I am not looking away." On a clear morning in the autumn of the last year of the century, when the air had the cold, ringing quality of October, and the leaves on the willows along the creek had gone from gold to pale, and the mountains to the east had their first snow, me stood at the door of the school she had taught in for 20 years and watched the children arrive. They came up the road in their coats and hats, the children of the families who had been in Harlan Creek since before her time, and the children of the families who had come after, and they came through the door and took their seats, and the room filled with the sound and warmth of young people who expected to learn something, which was the sound she had been working toward her entire life. Stephen rode past on his way to the north pasture and saw her at the door and raised a hand, and she raised a hand back. And in the gesture was everything that 20 years of a life together had made of two people who had recognized each other across a dusty street on an autumn afternoon in 1879, and decided, with the plain and mutual honesty that had always been their way, to find out what that recognition meant. It had meant this. All of this and more of it still to come, in the good country under the high sky where the creek ran in its steady channel, and the stars came every night in their extraordinary numbers, and the ranch sat solid and worked and known in the morning light, and the school sat at the north edge of town with its level blackboard, and its repaired stove pipe, and the sound of children learning how to understand the world they had arrived in. The stage from Albuquerque came into town at noon as it always did, raising its familiar cloud of red dust that settled over the main street in the way it always had, and the driver jumped down from the box, and no one in particular paid it much attention because Harlan Creek was a town now, not a frontier outpost, and stages came and went and the world came and went with them, and what stayed was what had been made to stay. Built from work and time and the particular courage of showing up as exactly who you are and trusting that the world will make room for it. It had made plenty of room.